Chair Kelly, we're live and ready to go.
Okay. We are now in order, and we're going to have a briefing from Legislative Services. Okay.
Good afternoon. This is David Romans from the Department of Legislative Services. We're going to provide you with a very brief overview of the governor's budget proposal, and then happy to answer whatever questions committee members have. I think we're going to share the document on the screen. That's okay. All right, here we go. So this is our quick look at the budget. Starting right at the top, you can see the budget is about $49.4 billion for fiscal 22 under the governor's proposal. It's actually $1 billion less than in the current fiscal year. The decrease is really attributable to federal funds, and the federal dollars are declining for two reasons. The first is that the SNAP program that provides food assistance to people and is federally funded has a very high caseload right now given the economy and the pandemic. It's expected to decline in fiscal 22 as the economy recovers, and that probably takes $1 billion of federal funds out of the 22 budget compared to 21. And the other reason is there's a lot of CARES Act funds in 21's budget that is not in 22. One other thing to note about federal funds is the governor did not include any of the federal money that we will receive from the December congressional stimulus actions. So there should be about 1.3 to 1.4 billion of federal funds that will eventually pass through the state budget, and probably in fiscal 21, that have not been added to the budget yet. We're expecting to see them in a supplemental budget later on in the session. And of course, there's also the possibility if additional congressional actions result in more stimulus over the next couple of months, that there will be an additional round of federal funding that will get added to the budget before the end of session. So the budget you see at the end of session may look quite a bit different than what you have in front of you right now. In terms of the general fund, it does grow over $1 billion, 1.3 billion, in part because there's a significant backfilling of federal funds from Medicaid. We're currently receiving an enhanced federal Medicaid match that we're assuming will go away at the end of June, and that's what's assumed in the budget. It actually has turned out President Biden has notified the states that they will get the enhanced federal match through the end of the calendar year. So there'll be some budget relief, over $300 million of budget relief that is not incorporated in the budget at the moment. Other things to know about the general fund. The governor is leaving almost a $200 million fund balance at the end of fiscal 22 under his plan. He's also leaving about $1 billion in the rainy day fund, which is 5% of general fund revenue. So there's a healthy amount of reserves as sort of a protection if the economy slows down further in the coming months. Let's go to the next slide. All right, the kind of key highlight or initiative, if you will, in the governor's proposal is tax relief. And the components of the tax relief are highlighted at the top of page 2. First, there's the Relief Act. There's 3 key components of the Relief Act, and all 3 of these were approved by Budget and Tax, and I guess will be on the floor for debate this week. The first is to repeal state and local income taxes on unemployment benefits, and you can see that reduces state revenues in the governor's assumptions by about 50 million in the current year and 20 million in fiscal 22. That is a permanent change in law, so it will continue beyond fiscal 22. Then there are stimulus payments to people who receive the earned income tax credit in either 2019, tax year 2019, or for tax year 2020. The maximum a family could get if they received it in both years is $750. The maximum for an individual is $450. Then you have the sales tax vendor credit. This would allow businesses with sales of up to $100,000 in a month to retain $3,000 of the sales tax they collect for that month, and they can do so for 4 months. So ultimately, they could retain about $12,000 to provide them with some financial assistance. And that's just a one-time 4-month thing that would go into effect in the month following enactment of the legislation. The governor has also proposed other tax relief that's unrelated to the Relief Act and not in the Relief Act. A lot of these provisions are similar to what you've seen in recent years related to military retirement income. Hometown Heroes. Governor also wants to expand the research and development tax credit. And then it's not shown as having a fiscal impact in the chart here because it doesn't start until fiscal 23. But the governor is also proposing to phase out the income tax on retirement income. That is a very significant impact. It's over 300 million a year when it's fully implemented. But again, it wouldn't start until 23 and wouldn't really be fully impacting us until about fiscal 26. Now, the bottom chart tries to show you how does this budget balance with all this tax relief. So before you consider anything that requires legislative action, the budget is out of balance by about 188 million for fiscal 22. Then you layer on the revenue losses from these various tax relief proposals. And the governor balances it or pulls it all together with a little over 1 billion of actions in a budget reconciliation and financing act. And that really breaks into two large components. One is about 826 million of spending reductions. The biggest single item is actually the rainy day fund. The governor is supposed to make over $500 million appropriation to the rainy day fund, mainly taking money that was left over at the end of fiscal 20 and putting it into the rainy day fund. He's asking to be relieved from most of that mandate, saving 422 million. As I mentioned at the start, he still leaves about $1 billion in the rainy day fund. The second major budget reduction action, which may be of interest to this committee, is that the Maryland Health Exchange has built up a large balance in its reinsurance program. They have roughly 400 million in balance of state funds. And it does not appear that they need that money, at least in the near term, to support the subsidies that they provide for the individual market. So the governor is proposing to use 100 million a year starting in fiscal 21 to support the Medicaid program rather than the reinsurance program. And his proposal would continue that through fiscal 26. And again, that's a BRFA item. So the legislature has a chance to undo it or modify it if it's not satisfactory. On the transfer revenue side, which is the other piece of the BRFA, there's about 200 million of actions, all temporary actions. The most notable is the transfer tax revenues, about 101 million of it is for fiscal 22. The governor is diverting to the general fund. For those who like the program supported by the transfer tax, the good news is that the governor is fully backfilling this in the capital budget with bonds in fiscal 22 to support program open space and related activities. Let's go to the next page. All right, this slide here, this graphic here shows you the structural budget outlook under the governor's plan for fiscal 22 through 26. So when we talk about structural, we're just comparing ongoing revenues to ongoing spending. So we're ignoring fund balance transfers and sort of one-time actions. And for fiscal 22, we're nearly structurally balanced, which we have not been very often in recent years, only 76 million short of structural balance. In the out years, you see about a 400 to 500 million gap each year. A significant portion of that, especially when you get to 25 and 26, is related to the proposal to eliminate the income tax on retirement income. If that didn't happen, we'd be very close to structurally balanced under the governor's plan in those out years. And we really have not been at an outlook like that in a very long time. Some key features of the budget that you should be aware of. First, K through 12 education formulas are fully funded. And in fact, the governor is using the Blueprint Fund, which are revenues dedicated to education enhancements, to support two notable and significant enhancements this year. One is to hold harmless school systems for enrollment declines. Statewide, we've seen enrollment decline by more than 2% for this school year, which would reduce the amount of money going out through the formulas in fiscal 22. So the governor is holding all the school systems harmless. They will all get a small amount of growth in fiscal 22 due to this 214 million. In addition, on top of that, he is adding 152 million of Blueprint funds for supplemental instruction and tutoring to try to address some of the learning loss that's believed to have occurred during the pandemic. In terms of healthcare providers, there is an acceleration of planned rate increases for many of the healthcare providers, including those serving the developmentally disabled and those with behavioral health needs. They were supposed to get a 4% increase July 1. It has been accelerated to January 1st of this year. So those providers are already seeing that additional funding, and that's funded in a deficiency appropriation. There's also money to provide a little extra assistance to people receiving temporary cash assistance benefits. These are among the poorest families in the state. They will receive an extra $100 per recipient per month for 6 months, January of this calendar year through June of this calendar year, again, to sort of help them through the pandemic. Let's go to the next slide. A few other things I just want to highlight about the budget that might be of interest. One, in terms of local aid, the governor has pretty much funded local aid programs fully. There's one large exception to that, and that's community colleges. They were supposed to get about 41 million increase, more than 12%. The governor is proposing in the BRFA to cut that back to only a 14 million, or a little over 5% increase, so saving about 28 or 27 million dollars through that cut. Again, that's a BRFA action that the budget committees will be taking a look at. Higher education, University System of Maryland in-state tuition being held to a 2% growth rate. One other notable reduction related to higher ed that's in the BRFA is the Selinger formula for non-public higher education institutions is being level funded. It was supposed to grow by almost 30 million, which was an enormous increase for that program. In state employees, there is no broad-based general salary increase in the fiscal 22 budget for state employees. There are increases that were negotiated with the law enforcement officers union. And a couple of the other unions have negotiated a $500 bonus and a 1% COLA, both of which are contingent on revenues in the current year exceeding the official estimate by a certain amount. Notably, absent from the agreements with the administration is AFSCME, who's agreed to nothing with the administration and would currently get no increase in fiscal 22, even if those revenue targets are achieved. One comment about the capital budget: it's a 1.1 billion of bonds being proposed by the governor. That's consistent with the Spending Affordability Committee proposal. He's also supplementing that with 244 million of cash from bond premiums that we're expecting to receive. So that's a lot of additional projects being funded. Despite that, the governor left no room in the capital budget for legislative bond initiatives. So there will need to be cuts to the governor's proposal or some identification of other resources that could support legislative bond initiatives. Let's continue. Let's skip the next page. We can skip that slide. The next couple of slides are the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act and other legislative initiatives that impact the budget. I think we've talked about the key ones on this page. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so at the top of this chart, you can see some of the key reductions that are contingent on the BRFA. I mentioned the Selinger formula, the CADE funding. You can see the Arts Council is being level funded, then some other smaller cuts in that top grouping. And then under fund swaps, you see that reinsurance money in fiscal 21 and 22 from the health exchange being taken. A couple of other health-related items in that grouping. The Medicaid deficit assessment, which is the assessment on hospitals. The governor is proposing to increase it above the level assumed in current law by 35 million in both fiscal 21 and 22. And then he's taking fund balance from the Medical Cannabis Commission fund balance to support the Behavioral Health Administration and some of its programmatic costs. And those are sort of the highlights of the BRFA. We can skip the next slide. All right, I just wanted to talk about two last topics. The first is the Blueprint Fund. There's a lot of attention being paid to K through 12 education. And there's really two revenue streams that the General Assembly has dedicated to education on an ongoing basis. And they're both highlighted in the top part of this chart. One is the lockbox for the Education Trust Fund, that's casino revenues. And you can see by fiscal 23, 550 million or more each year will be in the lockbox to fund education enhancements. And then there's the Blueprint revenue stream itself, which is largely sales tax revenues for online sales. Not all of them go to the Blueprint, but quite a few of them. And you can see that generates nearly $500 million a year for most of the period shown. So we have almost $1 billion a year being dedicated to education enhancements on the revenue side. And with the governor having vetoed the Kerwin bill, there really isn't much in the way of statutory education enhancements to spend that money. And that's what that top part of that chart shows, is that without some decisions about education enhancements going forward, we would build up a large fund balance in the Blueprint Fund. Now, certainly the Blueprint revenue part of that could be diverted to other purposes. but under current law, it goes to education, and the lockbox can only be used for education. There's a lot of money tied up for education. So then the other question we try to answer in this chart is, well, what's the impact of overriding the veto? And we've incorporated 3 bills into that analysis. One is there was a bill that applied the sales tax to digital downloads and dedicated that revenue to the Blueprint Fund. Governor vetoed that. He also vetoed the Blueprint spending bill, which is shown in the chart. And the Built to Learn Act, the school construction bill, was contingent on the Blueprint Kirwan bill. So if the veto is overridden, the Built to Learn Act becomes law. And the bottom line is that that would add about $1 billion of spending starting in fiscal 23, growing to 1.7 billion of spending in fiscal 26 on education. So bottom line is the second to last line on the chart, ending balance of the Blueprint Fund after the veto overrides. And what you can see is really there's enough money in the Blueprint Fund to support the Kirwan education proposal through fiscal 25. It's only starting in fiscal 26 that we would need to start supplementing the Blueprint Fund with general funds. It would require about 195 million in 26. If we were to extend this chart out into the future, that number would grow to more than 500 million a year of general fund support. So in the near term, you have the revenues to support the Kirwan proposal. In the long term, there's still going to have to be other resources dedicated to it. Next slide. Just shows you the Blueprint Fund expenditures that the governor proposed for fiscal 22 and compares them to the 21 spending from the Blueprint Fund. I've highlighted for you the 2 big things of that Hold Harmless grant, 214 million, the supplemental instruction money for tutoring and so forth at 152 million. You see a decrease in pre-K funding there of 10 million. That's because of the enrollment declines statewide. It's not because of any policy decision the governor made. And those are really the major highlights in that chart for the Blueprint Fund. All right, let's skip the next 2 slides. All right, the last thing I just wanted to highlight for you is all the federal stimulus money that we've received between the CARES Act and enhanced Medicaid match and the December stimulus. The blue bars in this chart show you the CARES Act money, the yellow bars, the December stimulus. And so we got about 30 billion that's shown here. The majority of it, 18 billion, went to business assistance, mainly through the Paycheck Protection Program, which went direct from the feds to the various businesses that applied. You can see nearly $4 billion going to the health area and over 2 billion for transportation, with about half of that, a little more than half of that, going to WMATA. And you can see there's also significant chunks of money going to education and higher ed and so forth to help respond to the pandemic. 2 things I'll note that are not in this graphic are we've gotten almost 8 billion of federally supported unemployment insurance benefits on top of the normal unemployment insurance that the state would pay out. And there's also over 1 billion of extra SNAP benefits that have been paid out over the last year. So when you add that all together, we've gotten nearly 40 billion of federal assistance to respond to the pandemic. I think you have the whole document. There's a lot more information in our fiscal briefing document, but I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you have, because I think that gives you kind of the high level overview.
If you don't mind, I'd start with just one. Does the government do anything to help the situation for behavioral health agencies that haven't been properly reimbursed by Beacon?
So the state, as you probably know, made emergency payments because we were having so much trouble with the vendor making payments. And the health department believes we actually overpaid based on utilization of care by 163 million. And so the health department plans over some extended period of time, and they have not specified what that would be, to recoup the 163 million of overpayments from the providers. So I think that's the big issue is, does the General Assembly want to have all of that money recouped, only want some of it to be recouped, none of it? I think that's going to be an issue for your committee and the budget committees to think
I don't believe that what the health department is saying reflects reality at all from everything I've seen. So I really think we're going to lose some providers, and many more people are needing mental health treatment right now because of depression and the life experience they're going through with the pandemic. And what does the governor do for essential workers in jails and places like that?
Yeah, so the state employees are continuing to be paid who work in those sort of settings are continuing to be paid a little bit extra above what they would normally be paid each month. And there is money in the budget to continue that in fiscal 21.
That's not very much.
It's not a huge amount, but there
No.
is a little bit extra.
Okay, are there other questions?
Yes, ma'am, Madam Chair. May I ask a question?
Sure.
David, you had mentioned about the reinsurance fund that the exchange had, that there's some type of surplus. Can you go over that one more time and explain to us how did we get to that point? And then I guess the follow-up after that is there was a proposal to reallocate that money to somewhere else. I missed that part.
Sure. So back a few years ago, when we were having issues with the individual market and people not wanting to participate because it was so expensive, the General Assembly created this reinsurance fund, and it gets money from a tax on health insurers, as well as, and this was the primary goal, gets a significant federal subsidy. And it turns out that the federal subsidy has been more than enough to fully fund the reinsurance program, and then it's worked quite well, actually, I think. So we haven't been spending any of the state money that we've been collecting and dedicating to the reinsurance fund. So they've built up a balance of close to $400 million that at the moment they're not using. So what the governor is proposing to do is to take $100 million a year of that money and use it to fund the Medicaid program. So just helping to relieve the general fund of funding Medicaid. Now, I'm sure the health exchange and some members of this committee may well have had other ideas for ways we could use that money to further subsidize people to get even more people enrolled in the health exchange. So I think that's the trade-off that the General Assembly needs to think about this session is what's the best use of that money? Is it budget relief for Medicaid, or are there other things that you want to do with that money to further strengthen the exchange and the individual market?
Right, but when we decided to establish the fund, I thought at the time in order to draw down on the federal money, it was required that we had some type of contribution to it, correct?
That is correct, and that's why we set up the state funding, and we thought we'd actually have to use some of that money to properly support it. But the federal money has kind of overwhelmed what we expect, the expectations that the actuaries had at the time. So I think we still need to have the revenue stream there and have some state money available, but the administration's position is we don't need to be sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars, given that the federal money is adequate to support the existing program.
Got you. And then the last question I have, at least for right now, is you had mentioned that there would be a reduction in the funding that will go to the community colleges. Specifically, I know Baltimore City community colleges in a different situation structurally.
Yeah.
In the current fiscal period, they were the only community college that was cut by $3 million. How does that reconcile with the reduction that the governor's proposing?
Right. So Baltimore City Community College, as you say, has a separate formula, and they're treated different than the other community colleges. And they got a significant cut through the Board of Public Works, over $3 million, as you referenced. The governor is fully funding their formula this year, so they get all of that $3 million back, kind of going forward. So their formula is fully funded. I think it's about a $3.5 to $4 million increase over where they are in the current year.
Right. So they're getting the full formula as it is, but they're not recouping the $3 million that was taken from this.
No, they're getting fully funded. The other community colleges are getting an increase, but not the increase that the formula calls for.
Got you. But can the other community college expect some type of decrease because the governor is reducing the amount that goes to community colleges?
Well, they're getting an increase, but it's not the increase they expected. So they're getting 5% increase instead of 13%. So they're disappointed that they didn't get what they expected, but they are getting growth over the current year.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, David.
Okay. Are there other questions?
Madam Chair.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes. Back to if we could go back to the slide on the that looks at the blueprint and what would result there. Yes, thank you. So as I look at this, you tell me if I'm getting this wrong, David, and I appreciate the thorough breakdown you give as always. 2021, 2022, all the way through 2025, 2026. That's those top 5 lines, ending balance of Blueprint Fund. That's what we're going to get now, right?
Correct. That's the revenue that's dedicated that's going to be available for enhancements under current law.
And is that with or without the current tax increase that is in balance? The governor vetoed it, so that's not included in that.
That is not included. That's in the bottom part of the chart. It's not in the top part.
Okay, and also obviously not included because it's revenue, but it doesn't. So really, there's a lot of money going to be available, just not as much as Kerwin calls for, right?
Correct.
So really, it would be possible for policymakers, and I know it's not your job to tell us, to make policy suggestions, but it would be possible for policymakers to look at the current outstanding obligation of Kerwin and say, we could do something somewhat less of this than this, but still pretty significant with that cushion that we have, that we expect in the Blueprint Fund.
Right. As I said, you've got basically $1 billion a year being dedicated under current law to the Blueprint and other education enhancements. So you have $1 billion a year to spend. So that could certainly support a robust program, but not the one that the Kerwin Commission had proposed.
So if we overrode the governor's veto on Kerwin, that final 2026, it says 4,756. How much above, you're saying that we would be, it looks to me like we would be, if we overrode the veto on both, we'd be like 1.5. How much is that 1,582 over?
Yes. You'd be spending, by fiscal 26, you'd be spending 1.6 billion for Kerwin, about 1.7 for Kerwin, but you get 120 million of revenue if you override the sales tax on digital downloads. So that 1.6 billion of Kerwin, the Blueprint Fund wouldn't be able to fully fund it. So you need about 100, the next line down, 195 million of general funds.
But really, with some small adjustments to what passed, we could have a pretty significant increase year over year in education spending targeted to the needs that we have without necessarily having to commit to quite as much spending and any tax increases.
That's true.
Theoretically.
I mean, yes, you certainly have the revenue available to do quite a bit.
Thank you very much.
Are there other questions?
Yes, Madam Chair. Senator Feldman.
Sure, go ahead.
So Dave, just back on the reinsurance program. So as you point out, it is true that Delegate Pena-Melnick at the commission that we co-chair, we do have some ideas for where that extra money goes. In fact, I'll have a bill later this session enabling the exchange to do some of those things. But that aside, just explain this a little bit. I understand that there's more money than we really need right now for reinsurance, but I've been operating on the assumption that the money for that program currently runs out in 2023, right? We got a 5-year waiver to do the reinsurance program. The money, this funding mechanism that you're referring to, the governor's grabbing this 100 million without grabbing it. So am I wrong? I mean, so just to be clear, I mean, we're taking this money from a fund that would expire in 2023, and we haven't yet figured out what we're going to do past 2023. This is such a great idea. We want to keep premiums down. This has been a great success. So maybe could you just clarify a little bit in my own mind about this funding ending by 2023, and then this 100 million you're talking about and all this?
Sure. So you're correct. The federal waiver that we get, hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money to support reinsurance expires after 2023, calendar 2023. So the state would certainly be most likely to apply for another waiver. We don't know whether we would get that or not, or what the terms would be. But yeah, the existing reinsurance program, essentially the federal money would go away after 23. The state money that's sitting there and the existing funding streams would not be enough to.
Right. So that's the point, is just to be clear, this assessment that we've been funding it, I mean, it's not going to be enough to get us past mid 2023 or something. So it's not like, I mean, the way you were describing it, there's just more money than we need. The governor's grabbing 100 million this year to go to Medicaid. which kind of sounds sort of harmless, but it's not quite so simple. I guess I just wanted to make that point, Chair Kelly, that,
Sure.
that this is money that could be used, yes, for other things, but at a bare minimum could be used to help take our reinsurance program past 2023. So,
And that's very important.
yeah, thank you.
All right. Who else has a question? No questions? Well, in that case, we want to thank you for the briefing, and will you still be available if we think of some things we need to ask you?
Of course.
Okay, because we surely will. This is a lot to take in all at once.
Sure.
Thanks so very much to you and the Legislative Services. And colleagues, those of you on executive noms, remember at 5 o'clock, we've got executive noms. Okay. Thank you.